controlled purchases of crack across the east and the west sides. Notably, in that time period, an undercover officer was never turned away for lack of supply. If a dealer ran out of crack, he would pool his supply with his co-conspirators. It was a round-the-clock operation. While these two crews generally distributed crack separately on their respective sides, there were members of each crew that were permitted to cross over and sell on each side of the Lincoln houses. Moreover, members of each crew protected each other's right to sell exclusively in Lincoln. Outsiders were not allowed. In particular, on the west side, this protection was done through violence and use of firearms. Firearms were held directly by individuals and were also placed strategically throughout the west side, so that members of the west side crew would have easy access. These firearms were left in places such as garbages, scaffolding, and the grass, communal spaces also shared by children and other residents. The West Side crew further engaged in violent rivalries with neighboring housing development drug crews. One such crew was the Goodfellas, who operated a few blocks south into the vicinity of 129th Street. While the East Side crew of Lincoln was generally less violent, it benefited from the West Side crew's protection of Lincoln's turf. Moreover, the East and West Side crews have interfered with the lives of law-abiding residents of the Lincoln houses on a daily basis. Most of the crack sales made to the UCs were made in elevators, stairwells, lobbies, and public hallways. The videos of certain of these sales show the defendants slinging crack while surrounded by children in public spaces at all times of day and night. Residents of the Lincoln houses could not enter or exit certain buildings without running into these crack sale operations, such as Tommy Hilfiger and Fatman brand, cause a lot of members were in fact on the heavier side. They also had an NBA Jams brand, as well as Candyman and Urban Legend, the titles of two horror movies. One original member of Lincoln, Lincoln Over Everything, was Mike, aka Heir the Don. Heir. Mike was born in 1976 in Harlem Hospital. Before the age of 1, he and his siblings moved into the nearby Abraham Lincoln projects located at 2140 Madison Avenue. Even at this time, the projects already had a notorious history of drugs and violence. His parents were both employed, but still dealt with the dire conditions under which they lived in. They attempted to provide their children with a stable environment in which to grow and develop. Back in these days, most young people participated in extracurricular activities, such as basketball at the renowned Millbank program in Harlem, and other programs at the nearby Abyssinia Baptist Church. Mike and others his age used to be there too, chilling. However, when Mike was 10 years old, his pops passed away from an overdose. He and his older brother began acting out, and their moms experienced problems with them. Soon, because of the influence of money-making Harlem and by older boys in the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects, Mike began hanging out and started selling drugs at a young age. The heroin game was already diminishing due to the crack and AIDS epidemic. Over the next several years, Mike, once promising young basketball prospect, had let go of those dreams. There was no more Millbank and Abyssinia basketball. It was time to get money. He would go on to set up shop primarily in building 2140, the 40 building. Although it sounds good, it doesn't end well for guys who live this life. Jermaine Reagan. Many of you may know him as Maine, Baby J, or Baby Maine. Baby Maine had came home in 97 on parole after being busted in 91 for murder. Baby Maine was born and raised in the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects. Although he was good to the ones he loved and cared for, he and his young crew ruled with a powerful fist. He unified the sale and distribution of drugs at the development through a power move that included force, violence, and death threats. Those who resisted were threatened, physically assaulted, and/or victims of shootings. Mike, who was selling drugs inside the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects, was threatened with violence if he did not comply with Jermaine's unification plan. Daddy O was an older drug dealer operating in and around the Lincoln houses. Indeed, guys like him had been hustling before Maine and his young crew and set the stage for the younger generation. Him and Baby Maine did not see eye to eye about merging the drug business. Rather than take a stand against Jermaine's threats to harm anyone who opposed his efforts to unify all drug sales at the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects, Mike left the area and sold drugs elsewhere. He did not return for almost 2 years. Around the time of Mike's departure, Maine and another Harlem drug dealer, Pop Lottie, was beefing. Allegedly, Pop Lottie had been sliced in the face by Maine. Harlem rapper, Mace, had a prior beef with Maine as well. Allegedly, Mace was dealing with Maine's girl, and would be chased out of Harlem in fear of his life. Before then, he would enlist Pop Lottie and his crew for protection against Maine. One day, in a dispute on 8th Avenue, Pop Lottie shot Maine 5 times. Maine survived. After Mace fled to Atlanta, the war between Maine and Pop Lottie elevated. After multiple shootings and crew members on both sides getting killed, eventually, in late 2000, Baby Maine was shot and killed on 5th Avenue. It happened directly across the street from the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects. His death is still unsolved. A year later, Pop Lottie was also killed. His murder is still unsolved as well.
This little succulent, elephant bush, likes a lot of water. This little succulent string of pearls, not so much. Even though all succulents are considered drought-tolerant plants, there's some pretty substantial differences between different varieties that will change how you care for them. For example, this Echeveria topsy-turvy needs full sun in the morning and afternoon shade in order to maintain its compact shape. On the other hand, Gasteria Little Warty is going to do best in the shade all day. It's also a great indoor grower, but both of them don't like to be watered very frequently. Then you have things like hens and chicks, a pretty common name for a number of succulents, including Echeveria elegans and...
The year was 2001, and other members were still getting money in Lincoln. It was said that by this time, the Lincoln crew was pulling in around $10,000 a day. Harold, aka Dewey, was a part of the third generation of his family to live in Lincoln. He was getting money on the east side of Lincoln. He would have some younger guys get down with him to sell drugs. At one point, mostly all the work being sold on the east side was his work. Indeed, he was an original member of Lincoln over everything. Kevin was another prominent member and leader of LOE. After the death of Maine in late 2000, Kevin would continue the drug operations in the Lincoln houses. Mr. Saxon was first arrested as a juvenile in 1985, the police said. He pleaded guilty to a robbery charge and received probation. 4 years later he was arrested again on various charges, including a murder charge that was later dismissed, and was sent to Rikers Island. There he repeatedly stabbed a prisoner, Terrence Smith, with a homemade knife after a dispute in the jail in February 1990. Mr. Smith died 20 days later. Ultimately, Mr. Saxon pleaded guilty to manslaughter and weapons possession charges, and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. He was conditionally released in early 1999, but soon afterward became a central target of the investigation of the Lincoln crew. As the head of that gang, Kevin killed a neighborhood man, Richard Gaines, who was a former amateur boxer, and he threatened to kill a grand jury witness and her family. While shooting at Gaines, one of Saxon's stray bullets busted the rear windshield of a car with a woman and 2 small children inside. In 2001, Kevin was arrested and charged with a Richard Gaines murder. On August 9, 2001, Saxon entered into a written cooperation agreement with the New York County District Attorney's Office, DAO. In the agreement, Saxon promised to do the following: to furnish information and testimony to the DAO in connection with the investigation and prosecution of criminal activity involving or related to violent drug gangs, 2. Testify before the grand jury and in any trial or trials or ancillary proceedings, 3. Refrain from any and all further criminal activity, and plead guilty to an 11-count indictment that included murder, weapons, and drug trafficking charges. In exchange for Saxon's promised cooperation, the DAO agreed that it would allow Saxon to withdraw his guilty plea to murder in the second degree, and replead to manslaughter in the first degree, once it had determined that Saxon had provided full and complete cooperation and testimony. If Saxon met his obligations under the agreement, the DAO agreed to recommend that he be sentenced to 18 years incarceration. The DAO further promised to take all reasonable precautions to ensure Saxon's safety and that of Saxon's family. The trial judge advised Saxon of the consequences of breaching the agreement, including the fact that the court would be free to impose the maximum sentence. Saxon then withdrew his not guilty plea, and pled guilty to the 11-count indictment. Saxon subsequently breached the agreement. On May 2, 2002, during transport to the Westchester County Jail in Valhalla, New York, after testifying before a grand jury in New York County, Saxon escaped. Authorities let Saxon make some phone calls as a token of gratitude. But DA officials suspected Saxon may have used the calls to alert his drug gang pals to his impending escape. Saxon, the savage 6-footer who weighed 260 pounds, had been in the back seat with Saxon, leaped out of the van and chased him, but quickly lost his man at West 161st Street and Ogden Avenue. A citywide manhunt ensued. He would escape to a chick's house in Brooklyn before making his way to Virginia on May 17. The next day, Saxon and his armed crew arrive in Newport News, Virginia, and check into the Days Inn Hotel at Warwick Boulevard. On May 19, 2 p.m., Saxon and his crew checked out of the Days Inn and visits a house in Yorktown. After 10 p.m., he is taken to 101 Solivay Street, where he stayed at in exchange for money and crack. After 20 days on the lam, the ringleader of the $10,000 a day Lincoln Crew heroin gang was nabbed at the crack house hideout in Yorktown, Virginia. The feared fugitive made one wrong move, using his cell phone, which they were able to track and learn his location. After his capture, Saxon appeared for sentencing on his guilty plea. After Saxon admitted his prior weapons and manslaughter convictions, the court determined that he was a predicate violent felony offender. In light of Saxon's criminal record, the serious nature of the charges to which he had pled guilty, and his breach of the cooperation agreement, the state asked the court to impose the maximum sentence of 119.5 years to life, and the maximum fine of $150,000. The judge ended up giving him 109 years, just 10 years under the max. Mike, aka Heir the Dawn. Mike received a sentence of 2 to 4 years imprisonment for his April 17, 2001 conviction for the attempted possession of a controlled substance. He was arrested 6 blocks away from the Abraham Lincoln public housing projects with a large rock of crack cocaine in his possession. On the sentence of 2 to 4 years imposed on May 8, 2001, Mike served 9 months in prison until he was paroled on February 18, 2002. Mike returned to Lincoln projects when the tension stemming from the Baby Maine murder had subsided. He returned and incrementally increased his clout within the crew to the point of becoming a respected member with authority to decide who could sell where. Mike had members of the crew selling for him on both the east and west sides of the Lincoln houses. He supplied others with packs of crack to sell, collected money from those who sold for him, and regularly monitored his workers while sitting in his car, the red Pontiac. Mike himself also sold crack in the Lincoln houses, typically out of 2140 Madison Avenue, the 40 building, and often made his sales late at night or early in the morning. There was also the 2110 building and an area known as the Cut. The Cut was an area in the vicinity of these buildings where guys were making and directing thousands of dollars. Allegedly, this was the lineup. Q was one of Mike's primary workers, who would pass out crack for other members to sell for Mike. Kevin, who had escaped prison earlier in the story, had a son, also named Kevin. Kevin's son also sold crack for Mike and was collecting money from those who also sold for him. You had Trev Wild, Kenny and C, whom Mike closely associated with. Trev Wild was a dangerous member and dealt with guns or problems to hold down Lincoln. He and Kenny, along with Heir, could decide where in the Lincoln houses members were permitted to sell. Members of Lincoln would be in and out of jail for selling crack as well firearms offenses and robberies. For example, Trav Game allegedly opened fire on a South Bronx strip club. It was 2014, early Christmas Day, when shots started sending patrons and passers-by scurrying for cover. It was said he appeared to be casually strolling past Sin City on Park Avenue, between the major Deegan Expressway and East 138th Street, around 3:10 a.m., when he turned and fired several shots into the front entrance of the Jiggle joint. He fell on foot. He was caught on surveillance video and was wanted on charges of reckless endangerment. Another known person in Lincoln houses was Ash. He'd been down since '01 and got his start by picking up and dropping off drugs for another established dealer. Indeed, he was one of the more violent members and testified about the violent culture of carrying and brandishing firearms to protect the Lincoln drug crew's turf and to gain respect from other members of the crew. Ash brandished a firearm at another member, Daunt, after Daunt disrespected him twice in 2 days, once by selling to Ash's crack customer and once by taking marijuana from Ash. Ash fired a gun in the air in approximately 2007 after he was approached by a rival gang member and felt threatened. Ash brandished a gun in the lobby of residential building in the Lincoln houses in approximately 2007 at a crack dealer who owed a friend money. Ash brandished a gun in front of a local store after an individual from outside of Lincoln disrespected him, and Ash hit someone with a gun who was accused of inappropriately touching a young girl in or about 2011. Indeed, Ash testified at trial that he was known in Lincoln for being someone who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain respect, even if it came to using guns. Ash also testified regarding his participation in a conspiracy to rob drug dealers in late 2014 and early 2015 with an individual named Mel, aka Ra. Ash said that between the end of 2014 and Ash's arrest in April 2015, Ash committed 3 robberies with Mel. First, in late 2014, Mel and Ash robbed a marijuana dealer of approximately 4 pounds of marijuana. Mel and Ash split the marijuana, which Ash used. During the course of this robbery, Ash and Mel each carried guns, and Ash held the victim at gunpoint. Second, in early 2015, Mel and Ash committed 2 robberies on one day. During the first robbery, Ash and Mel attempted to rob a drug dealer, but were unable to get in the door. Ash and Mel each carried firearms, and Ash brandished and discharged the one he carried. Ash fired the gun into the apartment when the occupants closed the door on Ash's arm. Third, on that same day, Ash and Mel attempted another drug. While waiting to get into the target apartment, Ash got into a physical altercation with a woman who tried to charge at him. Ash discharged the firearm, and the victim was hit in the abdomen. 2014 and 2015 were not the first he committed. Ash testified to committing an armed robbery of a clothing store in 2007. Ash further testified to his membership the Crips gang from approximately 2005 through 2013, his prior arrests and his several infractions in prison, including a prior conviction involving a physical altercation with a prison guard.
Vaping can deliver toxic metals like nickel and lead into your lungs. That's metal in your lungs.
Coleman was another member of Lincoln. One time before, Coleman had identified a man that shot him to police. He didn't snitch on crew members at the time, but because of this, he was never treated the same again. Although he could still sell drugs in Lincoln, guys were reluctant to give him work. Coleman and Ash would go on to testify against another member, Jamal, aka Yellow Tape himself, due to his willingness to handle beefs and shootings. He sold drugs, and was also one of the guys who could move around the east and west side of Lincoln houses. He violently robbed 2 people, including Mr. Vasquez, who testified at trial. After robbing Mr. Vasquez, the defendant recklessly fired shots within the Lincoln houses. Mr. Vasquez could have been killed, since he had to dodge shots, as could any unsuspecting resident or child, who may have been on the other side of that lobby window that Molly shot up. Ultimately, the defendant's use of guns and his status as a protector of the Lincoln drug crew distinguished him from many other members. Allegedly during this time, the cut, an area frequently harbored by Lincoln drug dealers, was getting shot up at least 4 times a week. This would be a part of the 129th Street Goodfellas beefs, and whatever other beefs they had. Harold, aka Dewey, would deal with his share of imprisonment as a result of this conspiracy. As we said earlier, he was the top guy on the east side of Lincoln at a point. He had guys working with her for him, such as Rocket, M, Ice, Afro, and others. As time progresses, new generations come along. The influences they have are those around them. By 2018, Lincoln members, such as Ibrahim, Centeno, E-Day, and EP, were locked up and indicted on a slew of charged. You also had young guys, like Trevor and S. Dodd. In one June 2017 crime, 3 members, Naquan, Norman and a third person, allegedly took a man's cell phone and wallet while holding a semi-automatic pistol to his head. That incident took place at East 118th Street and Lexington Avenue. 3 days earlier, 4 men, Alyssa, Centeno, Khalil and Trevor Gibbs, had allegedly used the same gun to shoot a man in the chest at Marcus Garvey Park. 2 months later, in August 2017, Aubrey Carter and Taven Hines allegedly shot at a group of young men on West 129th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, hitting one in the abdomen and another in the arm. the violence wouldn't end here. In March of 2019, a single punch sparked a wild brawl outside a Bronx bar that left one man dead and two others shot and stabbed. The one that died, Rocket. We mentioned Rocket earlier as someone who worked dealing drugs with Dewey on the east side. Basically, people were gathered outside the O's Tavern on East 138th Street in Mott Haven, greeting each other and chatting before an instigator sucker punches a man standing next to him. As more punches are thrown, a man dressed in red pulls a gun and shoots two people before running off. Meanwhile, Kareem, aka Rocket, defends the first person who was punched before being attacked by three men who repeatedly stab him in the chest. Rocket, 29 at the time, was rushed to Lincoln Hospital, but could not be saved. A 27-year-old man shot in the chest and stabbed in the face was taken to the same hospital in critical condition. A 30-year-old man stabbed in the face was listed in stable condition at Harlem Hospital. Allegedly, it was a dude named Maviles who punched and kicked Rocket as another dude, Williams, stabbed Rocket 11 times. Williams then allegedly stabbed the two survivors. This might not have really been covered, because the same week, the press was covering Trinitarios who were charged with the murder of 15-year-old Lissandro Guzman Fellas in the Bronx. For now, this about wraps it up. This is pretty much an outline of Lincoln houses. There are many more stories that we didn't cover, and look out down the line for us to revisit. But as always, stay low, and thanks for watching.
No matter how bad it gets out there, at least we ain't gotta worry about